So, the Middle Ages, despite the fact that we think it's sort of an area that was sort of doom and gloom and sort of the sad area where art really didn't thrive at all, that's not really true. Hi, this is Anita from 5 Minutes with Art. A lot of times when we talk about art, we talk about the Renaissance, we talk about the Impressionists, we talk about these eras of art. But one era of art talk about very much, but yet covers a large span of human history is the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages itself spanned from 500 AD to 1400 AD. And so, there's actually several critical movements that happened within the Middle Ages. But there's also some interesting fact about the Middle Ages art itself. Not everything was doom and gloom in the Middle Ages. When we talk about the Middle Ages, we think about it, everything being doom and gloom, but it was also quite a dynamic era. Europe started to be formed during the Middle Ages, so you started to see the formation of countries within Europe and different cultures. The Rome traditions gave way during this time to those of the Germanic people who were establishing the kingdoms in Europe. Western Europe was starting to be Christianized during the Middle Ages. That's why you began to see all the Christian crusades and all these other things going on. Vikings invaded Europe and beyond. Universities started in the Middle Ages. Marco Polo left on his famous trip to go explore China. The Black Plague was a terrible disease in the Middle Ages that killed about half of Europe's inhabitants. Joan Arc is actually from the Middle Ages too. So the Middle Ages was not just a time of doom and gloom and, the art there was just not all gloomy. And that's why we end up with basically, we've categorized it as 6 different art movements within the Middle Ages. One would be the early Christian art and architecture. So this would be the really sort of early Christian art that was taking place within the Middle Ages. And it was produced, really between 260 and 525 AD. So this is really, really very, very early Christian art. And there are still some samples of it that you can see, which is quite fascinating. The other one was the migration period, that this is when the Germanic people began to be formed. This was from 300 about 900. The German tribes were starting in Europe. And so you began to see some things which began to be very much like their history and their own culture. The other art movement in this era was the Byzantine art. And this emerged from the Christianized Greek cults of the Eastern Rome Empire. So even today, you can find Byzantine art in Istanbul, Turkey. This really is a very interesting art that you can still see today. Then you have the pre-Romanesque art, which also took place during the Middle Ages. And then you have the actual Romanesque art, which, was really, there's a lot of architecture, paintings, and sculptures for the Romanesque art. And then you, of course, have the Goth architecture and art. And the Goth architecture and art is interesting because that's still a popular sort of art even today. And you can find throughout Europe and many of the cathedrals some of the Goth type of windows that are quite well known and quite famous. So, the Middle Ages, despite the fact that we think it's sort of an area that was sort of doom and gloom and sort of the sad area where art really didn't thrive at all, that's not really true. And it's because of these artists that were in the Middle Ages that we were able to have such great art that was able to be produced as the Renaissance art, that the Renaissance artists were able to build upon that many of these artists were producing in the Middle Ages. One of the main differences is that many of the Middle Ages artists, we maybe don't know them by name as we know the Michelangelos, the Leonardo da Vinci's or the Raphaels, but we do have some of their art still surviving today. We'll put a link to our blog that we wrote about art in the Middle Ages onto our description here if you'd like to be able to learn a little bit more about the art and see some examples of some really quite fascinating art that was produced in the Middle Ages. This is Anita from 5 Minutes with Art. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you joining with us to listen for a little bit, for 5 minutes even each week, to learn something about art and to all improve our knowledge on art. We appreciate you for listening. We know without you it would not be possible, and we'd like to thank our team that helps put this together, in particular Rico, for helping to make this podcast possible. Thank you.